I've really come to understand about risk and myself for risk in the past several years is that risk is not static. And I think that sometimes we want to talk about risk, and we certainly want to talk about it with parents where there's some formula out there, right? It's like, oh, now this happened in your life, so you take fewer risks. And it's like, well, some days not. Like, what are we really talking about when we talk about risk? It's not black and white, and it's not logical and empirical.
Hi, this is Danae. I'm the founder of Simple Families. Simple Families is an online community for parents who are seeking a simpler, more intentional life. In this show, we focus on minimalism with kids, positive parenting, family wellness, and decreasing the mental load. My perspectives are based in my firsthand experience raising kids, but also rooted in my PhD in child development. So you're going to hear conversations that are based in research, but more importantly, real life. Thanks for joining us. Hi there. That voice you heard in the intro is Majka Burhardt. Majka is one of the world's leading female professional rock and ice climbers. She and her husband led globe-trotting, adventure-seeking lives. And then she learned that she was pregnant with twins. I think you're going to love hearing from Majka about her new book, More: Life on the Edge of Adventure and Motherhood. This book is so vulnerable and also so empowering. It actually originally started as a series of letters that she wrote to her twins in their earliest days. Today, Mike and I are talking about risk, parenthood, marriage, and moving through major life transitions. I'm thankful that she took time to share her wisdom with us. I think you'll enjoy this episode. Hi, Majka. How are you?
I'm doing good, Danae. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you?
Well, gosh, it's 8:30 on a Monday morning. So today I feel like I'm first the mom of two 6 and 3/4-year-olds because that's the new achievement as of a couple days ago. Meaning them being 6 and 3/4, not being their mom.
Right.
And I also am a professional climber, and I am the founder and executive director of a nonprofit called Legato that works to shift conservation to climate justice around the world.
Great. And you're based in New Hampshire.
Yeah, I live in Jackson, New Hampshire, so right up by Mount Washington.
Okay. Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Minneapolis, Minnesota, so Midwesterner through and through, but with Polish roots. So my dad grew up in Poland, which is where my name comes from, and came to the States in his 20s. And yeah, grew up in Minneapolis and then left there after high school and lived in Colorado for quite some time, and then moved to New Hampshire about 10 years ago.
Ah, great. And you are also married to a climber, right?
I am. Yeah. My husband is a full-time climber and mountain guide.
Great. So tell us a little bit about how this book was born.
Well, probably is the most important thing to know about More, the book, is that I wrote it by accident. I wrote it because when I found out I was pregnant, I had this flood of emotions and flood of questions about how I was going to pull it off. And then quickly thereafter, I found out I was pregnant with twins, and all of that ratcheted into like a morph speed of questions and emotions. And I said, how do I deal with this? And how I started handling it was writing letters, and writing letters to my twins. So I would record them audio letters, or I'd write them little notes. And this went all the way through my pregnancy to when they were little. And it wasn't until they're about 3 that I sat down and said, I think this might be a book. I think if I put this all together, this is something that I could share in the world. So it was really an unintentional way to land in the final product, which is a book of letters to them from when I found I was pregnant until they were 4.5, about my journey into motherhood and all of the emotional reality of the challenges and beauty of that.
I love that. I have shared a lot of journey into motherhood stories on the podcast because I think it's so important to hear what that looks like for different moms because it is so unique. And I think even though it is unique to every mom, that there are definitely common threads for almost all of us.
Yeah. And I think that we too often talk about it in a rearview mirror versus in the middle of it. And I think that in some ways that does moms and families a disservice, because those who are in the middle of it, when things feel hotter to the touch, when they feel more raw, more amazing, more difficult, it's like you don't have a landing place, because people who talk about it in the rear view, it's become softer. And I think that can make you feel a little lonely in your journey of the intensity at the moment.
Yes. Yes. Can you tell us? I am so ignorant about climbing. I think all of my climbing education comes from watching Free Solo. That's really all I know, which I loved that movie, by the way. From a psychological standpoint, I was fascinated by it.
Oh, I bet.
Um, but what does a career as a climber look like? What is the lifestyle like?
Yeah, that's really changed over the past couple decades too. So for me, a career as a climber means that since I was in my early 20s, climbing has been like the center of my life and also how I make money and make my way in the world. So I've been a professional climber for multiple decades, which means that I work with companies that are excited to have me be part of their roster and their team so that you are not only representing them in the world, but you're also using their products. I often tell people that being a professional climber and being a professional basketball player are quite similar, except for the amount of money that actually changes hands. But more and more, there are more professional climbers. And as climbing has grown and its market share has grown in the outdoor industry, there's additional pathways for people who are at the top end of that sport to be making durable incomes doing that. So
Mm.
for me, also, I was a climbing guide early in my life. I worked for Outward Bound first, and then I started working as a climbing guide and was a certified climbing guide very early in my life on that trajectory. And I've always found a way to smash climbing into quote unquote the real world. And I think that's how you make a living as a climber is you figure out a way to put the pieces together. So either you're on the guiding trajectory, or for me, I was writing and combining traveling and writing about climbing with climbing. And that was the way that I could put the pieces together in a way that was really sustainable.
Okay. So, thinking about climbing as a competitive sport, is it based on who gets to the top the fastest or who
Yeah.
climbs the hardest mountain? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, so there is competition climbing. Competition climbing is not what I do. So a lot of us who think, especially now that climbing just started being in the Olympics, it's like, oh, that must be what you do if you climb all the time. Some people definitely do that, and there's a very finite way of going about it, right? Like who gets to the top first, who's climbed fastest, who's climbed hardest. But the majority of people who are climbing without a scale that they are that they're not competing against other people. They're more challenging themselves and taking themselves through a journey. Maybe it's that they want to climb in lots of different places in the world or lots of different mediums between snow, rock, and ice, or become more proficient or more independent at it, or be able to work with lots of different partners. So the kind of climbing I do is much more about climbing the real substance versus a wall with fake holds on it. So when you think about competition climbing, it's usually like 90% of the time, it usually has to do with climbing a manufactured route that you can really control the environment. The climbing that I do is, I'm pointing out my window, even though no one can see it. It's out there. It's like, right now on the rock and ice cliffs of New Hampshire and then throughout the world. So it feels very different than what you might see in a competition climbing movie or, clip on YouTube or when you go to a climbing gym. But what's really neat is even in the past 5 years, how much climbing gyms have exploded, and then how much the understanding of climbing, the fact that like you've seen Free Solo, right? I mean,
Mhm.
these films are becoming mainstream, that there's a subgenre of Netflix. Al Gore was talking about this the other day at a event I was at for the American Alpine Club, and he's like, I love watching the climbing genre on Netflix, right? And the fact that there's a climbing genre on Netflix really speaks to the fact that this is, taken off and really growing.
Yeah, yeah. So what you're doing is basically you're kind of picking a spot on the mountain and figuring out how to climb it most effectively.
Yeah, exactly. And then
Okay.
adapting to the conditions. So if it's winter, it's ice climbing. If it's summer, it's rock climbing. It's challenging yourself that way. And for me, climbing has also brought me into the wider work I do as a social entrepreneur. So these days I'm a professional climber, but then I also run Legato. I don't guide full time anymore. I haven't done that in a long time, in part because my brain has always wanted to be in the global milieu in a way that wouldn't let me sit in the climbing and guiding lane without the and.
Mm. So you're carving out your own path essentially every time you get on a mountain.
Interesting. Um, wow, that's a complicated answer. Yes and no.
Okay.
There are established routes that you are following. So someone else did that route. They decided that they would link together this set of features either on a mountain or on a small cliff, and then you go and you link that, those set of features in the same way. You're going to do it in a way that works for your body, in a way that works for your risk tolerance in the moment. It's not rote memorization. Or you might be putting up a first ascent, a new route, meaning you're the first person to put together features on a cliff face or a mountain, if we want to continue with that analogy.
Okay. So from what I learned in free solo is that you really have to you really have to know your body. Like you have to be an expert on every single muscle and it just be incredibly tuned in to every part of yourself.
So certainly do what Alex does.
Okay.
To free solo, to climb without ropes, and to be that exposed and that high up with that level of consequence. Absolutely, there are many different ways of climbing than what Alex does in free solo.
Thank
To
you for
actually
educating me.
that's okay. To actually have a rope, to put protection in, so that should you fall, there are very minor consequences. So there are ways to ratchet it up or ratchet it down in terms of risk. So free solo, and Alex in his own right is such a phenom because he has this ability. And I'm sure for you with your background, you're like, wow, how does his brain work to be able to do that? Right. And
Mhm.
he's at one end of the spectrum. And then there are ways like when you go to a climbing gym, you can take so much of the risk out of it that you are literally, it's about how you are clipping into a carabiner that has a, permanent locking position that you engage. And then you're going up and down. And could you get hurt? I'm not going to say there's zero way for you to get hurt, but you are 99.99% sure you're going to be just fine.
Okay. So when you are calibrating risk in
Mhm.
climbing, does that take away some of your freedom and your ability to do what you want to do when you are taking less risk, or can you still climb and be the best climber you want to be while having minimal risk? Sorry, does that make sense? Is it always a balance between the 2?
No, it definitely makes sense. I'm thinking of an honest, I've never thought about that opposition, saying I'm going to choose different risk, which gives me less freedom. So I'm just giving it a moment in my head to say, is
Mhm.
that true? And I think what's interesting about discussing climbing with non-climbers is that kind of question can come down the pipeline. You're like, I never really thought of it that way. I don't think most people see it that way. It's not, oh dang, I feel really constrained, right? Like when you talk about freedom, the opposite of freedom is, yeah, like feeling like put upon or feeling like you don't have agency. And that isn't, you don't often think, oh, I have to make this choice to be safer and therefore I've given up some of my agency or given up some of my right to make choices. So I think that most climbers, you are creating your own Venn diagram of what are the conditions, what is the risk profile that I want to take, that I can take in this moment, that my partner can take, because there's a big storm that's coming in, because I'm on a known piece of rock or an unknown piece of rock. All those things factor in and are kind of like this data set running in your mind, whether or not you're fully coherent of all those choices. And you become more coherent of that the more climbing you do, right? Because like taking it out of a gym and putting it into the real world context. And if you are in charge of what the choices are, then eventually you start seeing that all these things are part of the matrix in the back, right? And then
Mhm.
you're ultimately making choices about what you're going to choose to do and how much risk you're exposing yourself to. But I don't think it's often a trade-off between, oh, I'd feel so much freer if I did it this way versus if I do it this way, I'm going to feel constrained, but I'm going to take less risk.
Okay. So as you've become a parent, I imagine that your risk taking has changed in some ways, or talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. What I've really come to understand about risk and myself for risk in the past several years is that risk is not static. And I think that sometimes we want to talk about risk, and we certainly want to talk about it with parents where there's some formula out there, right? It's like, oh, now this happened in your life, so you take fewer risks. And it's like, well, some days not. Like, what are we really talking about when we talk about risk? It's not black and white, and it's not logical and empirical. There's so much of it is how we think about something in our gut. So when I was thinking about this the other day, because a friend of mine, her sister just had twins, and I was thinking about how to help and how to support and how to and I was remembering like carrying newborns around. And I remember how like their head would stick out a little bit past your elbow. And I was always really worried about door jams. Like, what if I go too fast around a door jam and I slam their head into this door jam? And I'm like, what's wrong with me that I'm thinking that? Like, have I run into door? Like, it was this really weird thing. But what you're doing as a parent is just because you're seeing something doesn't mean you're like out of whack in your brain. You're just
Mhm.
suddenly noticing these obstacles that hadn't been there before. And you're like, man, I really better not careen my newborn's head into that door when I'm walking them out of the bedroom and into the bathroom at 2 a.m. So like layer that into climbing, how I approach risk is not as simple as, oh, this climb in front of me has this much risk. It's like, where am I at in the moment, right? Like, how much sleep did I get? How happy am I? How focused am I on this experience? And, for me as a parent, that means that when I step into climbing mode, I have more parts of my life that are narrowing down the funnel to be a climber in that second. Just like I have fewer, like my kid today, Peter took the kids to school and my son was really sad saying goodbye to me. And, I came up here because you and I were going to record this podcast. And beforehand I had to call a dentist, right? To like change an appointment. So all of those, it's like, well, what's the point of my identity at this moment and what things can I leave behind? I can climb the dentist and also like make sure that I have my system set up to talk to in the podcast, but I can't go climb and do those things at the same time. So you have to like shut some other pieces down, and then how you do that or how well you're able to do that, or if your kiddo is sick, all these other things factor into what decisions you're going to make are appropriate for you in the moment vis-a-vis risk. Does that make sense? So it's like, it's not linear. It's like, I'm a parent, therefore I don't do this, or I do this, because there's so much gray area. I think what we need to do is invite people into the conversation that like risk is so much more nuanced than we give it credit for across anything, not just if you're a climber. It's like, how do you think of risk differently driving when you're a parent? I hope most parents think about differently about texting and driving and all those different pieces of the puzzle, right? It's like, do you change because you are a parent? I think unequivocally, we all change how we see the world.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. I'm processing all of these things in my brain right now. And I think when we think about risk, we're always thinking about the potential outcomes and the bad things that could happen, right? Like thinking about bumping your newborn's heads into the wall. And then I'm thinking about how I can't even count the number of times that I bumped my older infant's head into the wall passing through a door frame when my kids were young, because that risk when they're older, it's less, right? When their skulls are hardening, it's less of a risk. And I wouldn't have thought about that as much when they were 10 months old, 11 months old. So it happened. And so always kind of weighing that risk and understanding how much you need to factor that in as you're moving about your days. And it's interesting to think about from a climbing perspective, because that's something that is so inherently important in your job, right? And in my job, I don't really feel like I think about risk that often. Well, I'm trying to figure out how risk factors into my job. And I think about, working with parents and the risk in saying something that may upset them or saying something that may make them feel inferior. That's something on the podcast I worry a lot about, right? Is figuring out how to talk in a way that people can hear without feeling like they are not enough. Because I think so often in conversations, you can hear about someone doing amazing things like yours and feel like, oh my gosh, like Micah's like climbing mountains while the kids are at school and I barely struggle to get the house cleaned up. So that, I think, in my mind is always, I'm weighing the risk of how these conversations land on different people. That's probably how it factors in for me. But it is something that I'm always thinking about. But it's not from a physical perspective so much.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, we all are taking risks by all means. Having climbing be part of my life, being a career, being something that is incredibly important to me, I'm pulling more, I have another element. I often talk about and think about a lot because my mom was a runner when I was growing up. And I sort of was raised around runners, but I'm not a runner. I'm like, man, life would be easier if I was a runner, right? Like if I could just kind of, although when I was talking to Emily Oster about it, it was really funny. She's like, yeah, but I spend a lot of time running and I'm super obsessive about it. So, careful what you wish for. But like net, it's less risky than going climbing. And I understand that. And I own that. And I also think that if we sort of take ourselves out of this very finite way of understanding it, it becomes much more interesting and we all get to be part of the conversation.
We're going to pause for a 2-minute word from today's sponsors. The first sponsor for today is Storyworth. I remember 20 years ago when my beloved grandmother passed away. I spent weeks, maybe months, gathering photographs, talking to family members, talking to friends, trying to piece together a life history, one that I could share with my own kids. It took a lot of time, it took a lot of work, but I'm glad that I have that. But what I wish I had was her story in her own words, which is why that I'm so grateful for a company like Storyworth that is not only making that possible, but making it easy Storyworth is an online service that helps you and your loved ones connect through sharing stories and memories and preserves them for years to come. We've gifted this across generations in our family, and it's been very much appreciated. Give all the moms in your life a meaningful gift that you'll both cherish for years. Storyworth. Right now, for a limited time, you'll save $10 on your first purchase when you go to storyworth.com/simple. That's story, STORY, worth, WORTH.com/simple to save $10 on your first purchase. Storyworth.com/simple. Speaking of memories, our next sponsor is Fast Growing Trees. If your yard is anything like mine, then you might need to breathe some life into it this spring. The past few places that we've lived, the number one thing that my kids have missed have been the trees, whether it was a beautiful flowering cherry tree or an easy to climb Japanese maple. The trees have played an important part of our story in our homes. So now that we're settled into what we think is our forever home, I love Fast Growing Trees because I was able to buy a Japanese maple to plant at a great price that my kids are going to love to climb. And with Fast Growing Trees 30-day Alive and Thrive guarantee, you know everything is going to look great fresh out of the box. So join over 1.5 million happy Fast Growing Trees customers. Go to fastgrowingtrees.com/simple now to get 15% off your entire order. Get 15% off at fastgrowingtrees.com/simple. So in the beginning of your book, you write that becoming a mom is the loneliest thing you've ever done. Can you talk a little bit about your journey and your decision to be about becoming a mom?
Yeah. Well, about that line and what that feels like, I think that there's this really wild thing that happens when you become a mom because you're doing something that is quite common, right? Like there are many people who choose to be child free, and yet the predominant choice that people make is to become parents. So you're doing something that millions and millions and millions of people are choosing to do that month in the world, and that are enacting. And yet it can feel so isolating. And then it can also feel really isolating if you're in partnership, which I think is a wild concept, right? Like I had a really great husband who was next to me through this whole process, and yet I still felt really lonely. And it's because you're not really seeing each other in the full reality of the experience you're having, because when you have little kids, you're just so in it. You're so deeply in it that you can't really see the person who's next to you, and you don't feel seen by them. And I think that that doesn't mean that your marriage is doomed. That doesn't mean that like you're being a bad person. I think that's just kind of the way it is. And we need to start understanding and loving people for that reality. So for me, when I decided to, I wasn't sure if I wanted to become a mom. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to. I waited until I was 39 before, or 38, I guess, before trying to become pregnant, and was lucky in that it was not a really difficult process for Peter and I. We just had to figure out how to start spending some time together. But what was really surprising was to learn that we were pregnant with twins. I mean, it wasn't shocking in the fact that I was 38, or I think I was 39 by the time I got pregnant, 38 when I started trying. It was like, wow, this was not the plan. This was so not going to be the way we were going to just crush it as parents and be able to tuck this kid into our lives and, not be
Yeah.
slowed down other than like a minor inconvenience around this whole giving birth type thing. But that should probably go pretty well. So no worries, right? Like just completely microphone drop, record scratch. Oh, what do you mean I have two children? What do you like? How is this even going to work? And so my journey into motherhood was really framed by that. And I think in when I'm in a really good place in the world, and I do believe this, I'm like, I love that I was given twins by the universe, because I think I had to lose parts of myself that were not serving me and get much more real and much more honest into my own BS, because I was going to have two babies at the same time. And I just couldn't pull off the life that I was trying to pull off anymore in that way. And I had to become much more human and much more humble. And I think it's a pretty cool gift that I've had in my life.
Yeah, yeah. So it sounds like you had a lot of idealizations around parenthood, what it was going to look like.
Yeah, I did. And I wouldn't have admitted that, right? Like I would have said, of course I know that it's not that easy. And of course, but it's amazing how you can say that, but at your core, you're still like, but I've got this, right? Like, I mean,
Right.
I had so many friends in parenthood with, one kid, two kids, three kids. I had no illusion that it was something that I could just, I would have never have told you that. But again, it's like that deep down core, which I think is also about, so I'm 46 and I think about, and I've had this conversation with a bunch of friends lately who are also parents with young kids. And we're all sort of amazed at how hard and how entrenched the systems are around gender division of labor, around what women are doing versus what men are doing. And I think that's that same moment when you're like, 10 years ago, before you had kids, and before you were part of this system, you really thought that we were further along or that you would be different. You're like, yeah, because like me and my partner have this different way of thinking, or I'm not going to be, I'm not going to fall prey to that ideology because I have a different way of doing it. And then all of a sudden you realize how intense those systems are and how they go up and down the chain, to paid family leave, to how COVID impacted everyone. And it's just that head scratch moment of saying, wow, this is a bigger deal than I gave it credit for.
Yeah, yeah. And I think about, I have two kids, not twins. And when I gave birth to my first, it was a very unifying experience for my partner and I. We like got together and poured all our love on this little being. And then the second one was very different in the sense that it was now divide and conquer. He takes the older
Mm-hmm.
one, I take the baby. So I think about as a mom of twins that you sort of had to skip right to that, the
Yeah, that's
divide
such a
and
great way to put
conquer.
it. Yeah.
Which is different. So you miss that kind of unifying experience of, being two people who are married, being able, living together, co-parenting, being able to kind of pour all this love and come together on this experience and
Yeah.
pass the baby back and forth and maybe take turns climbing. And now you're dividing and conquering. So that whole initial just start into parenthood, I can imagine looks so different for you because of that.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to put it. Yeah. I don't know any other way.
Yeah. Absolutely. So tell us what that first year looked like. Did you have a lot of childcare? Like, did you just stay home? What was that for you?
Yeah. So early on during my pregnancy, and I talk about this in the book, I'm a very practical person. It's like, okay, what do you mean I'm going to have two kids? Okay, how do you even have two babies, right? Like, what do you need to have two babies, and how do you like access resources for that? And starting to look at childcare. I live in an area of New Hampshire. So the sort of thing that people don't talk about when they choose alternative careers is sometimes when they pair having an alternative career with the thing that everybody does, those things don't work together so well, right? So it's like, oh, I love living in the mountains. Oh, wow, I really wish that I lived in a city where there were tons more services so that if I had an au pair, they would have tons of other au pairs and would also have public transportation. And instead I live where there's still no Uber service, right? So you really put those pieces together. You're like, oh,
Yeah.
this was a great plan. Not so much. So, for us, it was, okay, what does this mean? And really quickly, looking into childcare and doing the math of it, which is a shocking experience when you're going to have one kid, let alone two kids, then, discovered that an au pair would have been the best way for us to have like help financially, and then set out saying, how do we make this happen? Which was a wild process for Peter and I because there were no au pairs. Like you couldn't be an au pair in our valley. So we had to get a friend who would like agree to go through the training to be the, whatever it is, the advisor. And then we had to find people, and we kind of like ticked away at that journey for a number of years, and then switched to finding support from people who were in our valley, because we just found that it wasn't really sustainable to bring people from another country and who were really wanting to have a more urban experience. No matter how much we talked about how cool the skiing was, and they're like, I love that, that's so great, then they'd get here and they'd be like, whoa, it's really cold, and they're where are the
And
other au
lonely.
pairs? Exactly.
Right.
But yes, childcare was a part of it. I was home in that I was working at home. I made the decision to stay at home and work because I wanted to be close to my kids, but also do the work that was really important to me and that I also needed to get done in order to have the childcare, right? That all of those things for them to come together, I chose to be at home so I could nurse the babies and be part of it, and then be like running upstairs to my office. And I knew when I was doing that I might look back on it one day and say, that was a crazy way or a crazy making way to pull it off. But it was really important to me to try. And I wouldn't do it differently if I had it again, right? Like I love that I was part of my kids' lives. And it was also hard because I didn't get to step away, right? I didn't get to go and then come back. It was very much like I was in the milieu. And so if my kids were having a hard time and I was trying to work, I knew that they were having a hard time, which meant that I would kind of like move the pieces around to go and help. And that, a lot of that is in this book, and also um my questioning myself, like, am I making the right choice? How do I do this work again that it has the duality of wanting to do it and needing to do it, and also wanting to be a present mom? And how do I put those pieces together? And what does it look like? And what does it look like today?
Yeah. It sounds a lot like a lot of back and forth. Did you feel like you were trying to do all the things and not necessarily doing many of them well?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that is kind of the world, right? You're
Yeah.
like, well, I'm going to pull all these things off. Why do I feel like I'm sucking at each and every one of them?
Yeah.
And well, is the solution just to have fewer things that you're trying to achieve? I think, and for me, that wasn't a solution I was willing to consider. It was more like, how do I change my expectations about what doing it well is? How do
Mhm.
I celebrate the minor successes along the way? Like, celebrate the fact that I got to nurse my kids throughout this entire day and I finished a grant proposal, versus being focused on those margins of times when it didn't feel like it was super successful, right? Like, I was just hell bent on not giving up. It was, so then I had to, the give for me was more about how I understood all this and how I understood my mileposts and how I understood how I was judging myself at being quote unquote good at any one of them.
Yeah. Your book is very vulnerable. And I love that. And I love having vulnerable conversations. But I find that not everyone does. Have you found it easy or hard to find friends and other moms that are willing to get vulnerable and have these hard conversations with you?
I think you make a really good point, Danae. I don't think everybody wants to be vulnerable, or I don't think everybody wants to be vulnerable in the moment you want to be. I think we
Mm,
all are having our own journey to where it feels safe and okay to be vulnerable. And what I found is that I absolutely need those people in my life. And that's been how I have made my closest friends, right? It's like my closest friends and my confidants are people who I can have those conversations with. And I've also seen that I had friends before I became a mom who also are now, some of them who are moms now, who we can't meet on that level. Like they don't want to be there, which doesn't mean they don't go there with someone else, or maybe it also means that they're just not there in their journey. I think that it can feel, again, I think this goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, that there is still all this shame around speaking about something being hard that you also love doing. And it feels like if you
mm,
speak up and talk about like you're having a hard time, that you have to like backfill in, but I love my kids. And it's like I sometimes say, if I talk about how having two kids at once is hard, I'm like, oh God, I hope I get to like, it's like I get freaked out that some power that I don't even believe in is going to take one of my twins away. Right. It's like
mm,
being brave enough to hold space for yourself and others, that something can be hard and what you want to do, I think is
mm.
this new conversational space that we need to move into. And I think for me, I'm willing to go there and hope that other people can feel like the water's been tested to jump into that. And I think that I'm I'm really interested in those conversations, and I would be willing to bet that most people have a place for those at some time in their life, and it might just not be where you would expect.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like maybe earlier in parenthood, it was even easier to engage in some of those conversations. I don't know if you found this, but as my kids get older, I feel like um, it's harder to talk to some new friends, especially about some of the challenges because they're
Yeah.
getting older and they're supposed to be independent and you're supposed to have figured things out, which so it's not as easy to be as vulnerable about like tantrums and sleep challenges and that kind of thing, because if you're still dealing with those when your kids get older, like, is that a sign that you haven't done something right?
Well, it's also hard to find the time, the space. When do you get to do that
Mhm.
with new friends, right? Is it when you're waiting to pick up your kid,
Yeah.
at 5 o'clock from the after school programming, and is it that moment where someone's like, "How's it going?" And you say, well, today started out with 20 minutes of abject tears because my little boy didn't want me to, go to work today. Or you're like, oh, yeah,
Uh,
I had a pretty good day, right? It's like, are you willing to inject these little pieces of being human, or does that not possible? Or do you see that gets volleyed back and forth? And is that your entry into this friendship where you talk about those things? And I think, it's fascinating to me. The whole process of friendship and adulthood is fascinating to me.
mm, yeah, totally.
We need to make sure that we make those spaces for ourselves. And
Mhm.
then it's like giving an extra 20% to be vulnerable, where you might be surprised, where other people might have needed that as an entree
Yeah.
to that
Yeah.
conversation. I mean, that's the thing I've been blown away by having the book out for just a couple weeks now, is just the emails and the message that I get from
Mm.
people saying like, thank you for talking about
Yeah.
this, right? And like, and now I'm going to share this with my friends, or I'm going to share this with my spouse, because I really want my spouse to hear all this, not from me, but from someone else, so we can kind of talk about it like, wow, that woman was really in it. And then suddenly we get to talk about all these things that we haven't found a way to talk about ourselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about being there for the emotional vulnerability of your kids. And
Yeah.
that's something it sounds like has been a learning process for you, being able to process those big feelings and
Yeah.
emotions from your kids.
I mean, I still am trying to I feel like I had no idea that that was the biggest journey of parenthood. Like, maybe for everybody, but certainly didn't know that was going to be the biggest journey for me, right? And I had from my experience was that when my kids started really being able to emote and really being able to speak about their emotions, that I realized, and it really came up around anger. Like, you have these little kids who are like 2.5 and they're experiencing anger, and you're trying to talk to them like, yeah, in the way that we now understand. It's not like get it together and go away and like go sit on that step until you're done being angry or go to your room. It's like, oh, I hear that you're angry. I see that you're angry. And all of a sudden I'm like, wow, I would have liked someone to do that with me when I was 2, learning how to be angry. But as it turned out, that was not the parenting style of the late 70s when I turned 2. And it's certainly not what was going on in my family of origin, because my parents' marriage was falling apart at that time. So they were triaging other things, not was, their youngest entering her emotional development correctly. So
Yeah.
I think that for me, seeing my kids go through that and realizing that I really wanted to be present with them on this emotional journey, but that meant that I was also going to have to get wickedly vulnerable myself and own that I needed to go beyond a reparenting journey and a learning process. And it continues to this day, right? Like, my daughter said to me the other day, I was putting the kids to bed. My husband was working in Switzerland and they were going to bed late. And I just took this deep breath because, it's like, oh man, it's 20 minutes after bedtime and I'm really tired. And she said, Mama, I heard you take that breath and that makes me think you're frustrated, which makes me feel
Mm.
squidgy in my stomach. And I thought,
Oh, I love that.
right. And
I
on the
love
one
that
hand,
because it's just so tuned in for a
right?
6-year-old, right?
I know, right? And I'm like, wow, yay. And then I was just like, oh, damn it. What do I say to that? It's like, and
Right.
I had this brain fritz where I thought,
Yeah.
well, that's really good. But is this when I say, yes, but it's okay for mom to be frustrated? Or then does she hear that as like,
Mhm.
mom is frustrated, you need to fix it? And I just like, it was like 8 o'clock at night. And I just like, all the
Yeah.
circuits, did not work. And I was like, I love you. I hear you. And it's like, that's my next thing, is saying, how do I work with these kids who I've raised to be really present about their emotions and hold the both end, right? It's like
Mhm.
yes, you can feel squidgy when I'm frustrated, and sometimes mom's going to get frustrated, but that's not your fault. And how do I keep finding my way? And for me, what it comes down to with my kids is being really honest with them that I'm on a journey to learn how to be in the world just like they're on a journey, and not in the way like, hey, therefore you need to help teach me this, but like, we're all learning, right? And
Yeah.
that also helps me center myself to it, because I'm really intrigued with this way of parenting. And I also think that it takes time. It's a luxury to do it. You have to be willing to go to places in yourself that can sometimes be really tricky. And, I joke with some of my friends in a non-joking way. It's like, I don't know, sometimes I wish I could just go back in time and tell my kids to go to their room, right? Like, I wish I could like choose that style of parenting. But if we ever try to go back to that, my kids are so fritzed out by that. They're just like, wait, no,
Yeah.
that's not the agreement we have, right? Like, that's not at
Right.
all how our family handles things. It's like, oh yeah, well, I
Yeah.
guess this is the journey we're on. I guess everyone pack your bags. We're
Yeah.
going to keep going together.
But when some of that is deeply internalized within you, what is the expression? Like what's inside, like you're an orange, like what's inside when you're squeezed comes out. I don't know if I
Mm.
probably
Oh, I
botched
love
that,
that.
but so
Yeah.
that is what comes out, right? Like when you have
Yeah.
exhausted all of your positive, gentle resources, sometimes that
Yeah.
does come out.
Absolutely.
Um,
And
this
then what's
weekend. Oh, go ahead.
squeezed in that way is, for me, because I don't think I've ever processed how to be angry in my life, and that's something I talk about a lot in the book, I was like, oh wow, I don't have the skill set about this. I need to rapidly. It's like you need the skills in the moment that you have to have them, and I think that's what's really hard about parenthood is, I didn't have any idea that it would be so hard when my kids turned 2 or 2.5 to manage all this, but then. It's like, oh, I wish I was better at this very same moment that I'm noticing I need to have this ability. And how do I like quickly infuse myself with a higher level of understanding and learning?
Yeah, yeah. This weekend I was outside. We have an old tree house in our backyard, and it's the ropes on the that sort of go around the perimeter of it are kind of weak. So I have a very strict no bickering and arguing in the tree house rule for my kids, for safety reasons. And they were bickering in the tree house. And I started to go up the ladder to try to defuse and get one of them to come down so that we could continue to be safe. And I fell off the ladder
Oh,
and broke my ankle and banged up the rest of my body.
you're like, no big deal. This weekend I broke my ankle. I love it.
Right.
Yeah.
So like I am like right now trying to figure out how to shower, which is why I'm in my pajamas. But it's a very interesting parenting situation to be in, because in many ways, right, there's like this blame piece. Like my kids have both blamed themselves, right? Because I asked them to come down. I asked them to stop arguing. I told them that it was unsafe, and they witnessed the whole thing happen. But in many ways and I've said like, I'm in charge of my body. Like I am the one that was in control or not in control of my body at that time when I fell. But there is a lot of emotional pieces that come into that. And, but not just the actual incident itself and them seeing me like laying in excruciating pain on the ground,
Oh,
but also the aftermath of like the crying and the upsetness. And now my being short, right? Because like,
mhm,
I'm in pain and shouting orders from the sofa.
mhm.
So, but I feel like it's pressing me in this whole new way where I am wanting to be really sensitive to their emotions while at the same time, like I am physically incapacitated and, I'm not going to be at my best by any means. And I mean, even in the past 36 hours, I've already found that to be true. And I'm hopeful that in the way that I've raised them, in that I've given them a lot of grace to feel those big emotions, that they will in some way or have in some ways learned to reciprocate that, and knowing
Yeah.
that, hey, like I'm probably going to yell a little bit more this week. I'm
Yeah.
probably going to get more frustrated this week, and this isn't going to be the best of us. And I guess that's a piece that I'm always really hoping that I'm instilling in them, that giving grace, right? Like I give them a lot of grace to make mistakes and mess up, and I'm hopeful that they're learning to reciprocate that.
Yeah. What you're saying when you're talking about that, that's this question that I really have right now at the stage that I'm at in being a parent is because I really worry about that tendency that kids have to fix everything for their parents, right? So how do
Mhm.
we give our kids that space and grace to have these emotions and then have emotions ourselves and then talk about them with our kids, but then not have them be like, wow, my mom got frustrated a lot, and then start internalizing like, I better do this differently. Like in your case, being like, if I hadn't been bickering with my sibling, then my mom wouldn't have come. And it's like, you know, because the answer isn't to take your emotions out of it. But I do
Mhm.
like that's just, it's the piece of the like the board game that I feel like I'm playing right now that I don't really get, right? I'm like, how
Yeah.
can I tell them that I have these emotions and it's okay and it's my job to manage these, but to not have it kind of backfire into them to be like, whoa, my mom
Mhm.
was sad. My mom had a hard time. And somehow, and because you want to be able to use it and say, yeah, you know what? Like mama did get hurt, and in part it was because you were bickering and I had to come help. So how can we do that better? But you don't want that to be like
Right.
become like a shame or guilt thing.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and that night when I came home from the urgent care, I'm laying in the bed, and it was April 1st, April Fool's Day, which is probably my daughter's favorite holiday. She loves pranks. And I was kind of out of it. And she came into our room with graham crackers and crushed up a bunch of graham crackers in our bed and put them under the sheets. which which so I'm like laying with my foot up in
Oh,
excruciating pain, and she's crushing graham crackers under the sheet. I don't know how I didn't notice this going down.
yeah.
But this was I mean, it was meant to be funny. It was meant to be a
Mhm.
prank. So when my husband went to get into bed and he pulled the sheet back and there was a bunch of crushed graham
Oh,
crackers, like needless to say, the reaction was less than positive. There was no laughing.
yeah,
But that was a situation where, I didn't lean into it was no one's fault but mine that I fell off the treehouse. But that right there, that like crushing up the graham crackers in the bed, like that was a poor decision.
yeah,
And I did tell her that, like, that was a poor decision. And now we have to clean up this mess. And because of the day that we're feeling really frustrated.
yeah,
And so that, I did, I let her feel the full intensity of that in the sense that, like, we have to think things through, right? We have to think about the consequences of our actions and being
yeah,
really firm in that. Like, and she was sad. She was really sad. She felt horrible. But, I think that was something I felt okay letting her sit with the sort of the guilt of making that decision because I think that she can handle that, right?
yeah.
Making that mistake and coming back from it. I worry more about putting that kind of responsibility for something like me falling, right? I don't
Yeah,
think that that would be much more severe. So I don't
totally.
know, maybe letting them dabble in these feelings of taking responsibility for things that are things that they can easily come back from. I don't know if
That's
that's
such a
my
great way
answer,
of
but
thinking. No, I like that. Yeah, it's something I think a lot about.
baby steps. Right?
Always.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about marriage and how that has changed for you since adding kids.
Oh, someone told me the other day, someone asked me a question like, well, it seems like for you, having kids made your marriage feel harder. And I was like, no, for everyone. I was like,
Mhm.
I just think it's universal. It's just how we talk about it, which is a little bit different for everyone, or how, kind of where we're at. And to keep talking about like these journeys, like where we're at in the journey of understanding that or processing it or doing something about it. And, for me, we didn't talk in before having kids about how we were going to do it. We weren't like, because I mean, you don't really know. You don't know what it's going to be like. And also, there's all these phases that are in front of you. It's like, well, I don't know. I guess we'll figure it out. Right. Like, we'll figure it out. But there was not this understanding that, one of us would change our career at all. It was like, we will keep doing what we're doing and somehow it will work. And I wish we could have talked about it a little bit more. I don't know what tools we would have used or what knowledge we would have had in front of us. But I think that it's been really eye-opening to say, I am very committed to this marriage. I'm really acknowledging that we've added to what all, like, I want to say we've added stress, but I'm kind of hedging away from that word because I don't want to like equate my kids with stress, right? It's like, I'm committed to this marriage. We have more things that we're trying to make happen in the world, including raising two resilient little humans. How could this be automatic? How could this just be full of ease and moondrops and, unicorns? Like, it's, for me, it's really saying, what do we need in the moment to support each other, not just to be partners in a handoff, but actually so that we're partners and we come out the other side stronger and loving each other and having been vigilant to what we wanted out of marriage in the first place. And that can all sound great in theory, but it's the day-to-day doing that is so real. And that's what a lot of this book is about. It's like,
Mhm.
here is the emotional process of me saying, I want this, I'm really committed to this, and I'm also frustrated, and I'm also wondering that, seeing where I'm not being a great spouse, and I'm seeing where I'm frustrated that my husband isn't being a great spouse, but is he really not, or am I just not seeing him, right? And it's like, it's the mental cogitation we have, ping pongs all over in your brain,
Mhm.
but yet the way we talk about it in like what's forward facing is like, here's this clean dialogue of how I'm feeling about life. That's not what it feels like in real life. And so more is really the story of what it feels like in real life when you're having tons of these big feelings, right? Like, you are being that same as a kid. Like, you have a lot of big feelings. Here's what they feel like. Here's what they look like. Here's what it means to give word to them.
Yeah, yeah, and it makes me think of your breastfeeding journey. You breastfed for 2 years, right?
Yep. Yep.
And I imagine during that 2 years of breastfeeding twins that you probably felt a lot of mixed feelings about your husband. I mean, if he was able to get back out in the world, you were probably very much tethered to the twins. Tell me
Yeah.
about
And,
that.
it's really interesting. I've thought a lot about breastfeeding recently with the kids because I think it was such a way that we could all calm down, if that makes sense. Like it became this, I remember talking to people about like, here's how to stop breastfeeding. And every time I would talk to people about that, I'd be like, that just seems so hard, right? It's like, it's already feeling pretty legit. And this is something that actually works for us all. So why do I want to go make things hard? Like I like it just, I just couldn't wrap my head around it. Right.
Mhm.
And so I actually didn't feel overly tied to the kids because I was breastfeeding. Like I didn't resent it. I didn't feel like, oh, this is really, I really felt like it was this deep connection that I had to them. And I was able to, I mean, they both, Arena for a while was like on total bottle strike when she was little, but eventually like they were fine in either mechanism. But if I was
Okay.
around, breastfeeding was like a central part of our existence. I mean, even to the point when the kids were 2, I mean, they would nurse like so many times a day. And I could have changed that, right? I could have been like, nope, we're only going to nurse before we go to bed. But it's like, I'm here. Okay, here we are. Right. But I think I was really lucky that I had both. Like I was able to go be in the world and I could go
Mm.
climb. But what I didn't want to do was go be away for long, like for weeks on end or even for days on end. And that was both because of breastfeeding the kids, but also because I wanted to be around them. Right. Like
Mhm.
I was like, I want that, but I don't want it enough to give this up. And like that, like the tension between those two things was confusing to me and also really important for me to honor.
Mm. Now that they're school age, are they in a regular 9 to 3 school, or are they
Yep.
being homeschooled?
Yeah, they're
They
in a
are?
regular
Okay.
9 to 3 school. Yep, they just started the public school here in Jackson and they're in first grade.
Wow. So, are you traveling for weeks on
I
end, or
am.
what does that
I
look like? You are? Okay.
well, some. So, COVID was a big time. Yeah, like right
Yeah.
when I mean, that's going to change all of us forever, I would argue. And I think that we were just kind of opening up the funnel to more travel when COVID happened. And then obviously that closed down. And so now it's this like, well, what's the right amount of travel? I have been traveling a bunch in the past month because the book being out and a bunch for work for Legato. But I'm really trying to ask myself, like, what is worth it? What ranks high enough to have me step out of the family system? How do you think
Mhm.
about like kind of the family capital that you have as a parent and where do you want to spend it? My
Mhm.
kids are really aware when I'm gone. And then if I come home and then my spouse leaves, there's a impact on our family. Are we willing to
Yeah.
have that impact? How much of it? And I think so there's not a universal rule. We're kind of feeling it out again and saying, what does this look like given where our kids are at right now? And that's something that I want to try to be attentive to and try to build my travel. And thankfully, because I'm the executive director of this organization and I can make choices. I like all of the people who work at Legato around the world. Like we're really trying to talk about how you do it and have family and not just do it blindly and pretend that you don't have a family that you're
Yeah.
caretaking.
That's so important. Yeah. And then once you've figured it out, you have to recalibrate every week as family life
Absolutely.
changes. Your
Yeah,
kids grow.
because you're like, "Oh, and then this thing happened," or yeah. I mean, I think
Right.
that's like they're so not divorced from each other, and we know that, and then there's been this big reckoning because of what happened with COVID, but also like we're backsliding so fast. And how do we keep putting that front and center?
Mhm.
It's like people asking me, "Well, just bring your kids with you when you travel." And what I love to say to people when they say that to me is like, "Cool, do you want to pay for that? Like, do you want to give me
Yeah.
all the money to bring a caretaker? And then how do I mean, it's such an interesting
And a
construct."
tutor now, right? With school, that
Exactly.
makes it even more complicated.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally. You wanna give me a private
absolutely.
jet, and then the whole entourage will come travel, and then what do we talk about, like, the carbon impact, so yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Micah. This has been so great talking to you. Where can we find your book?
Yeah, so it's called More: Life on the Edge of Adventure and Motherhood. You can find it anywhere you buy books. If you want signed copies, you can hop to my website, and White Birch Books here in North Conway, can get you one, and Majka Burhardt on Instagram, and the biggest thing I would say to your community, Danae, is please read this and share it because I feel like this is part of how we shift this conversation and we get to build structures to support each other better.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'll put all those links in the show notes.
My pleasure. It was a great talking to you.
Thanks so much for tuning in. If you want the links to get in touch with Micah, go to simplefamilies.com/episode 345. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm glad you're here.